Welcome to the next in our series of Florida Tech Pioneer interviews. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Harry Weber. Welcome. Why don't you take a minute and tell our audience something about your early life, where you're from, your education.
All right. I guess the best place to start would be when I graduated from high school. And I went to work at a rug company. And that didn't last long because that was during the Korean War. And somehow or other the military got me, and I flew air sea rescue for 3 years. After getting out of school, I had electronics training. After getting out of the service, I had electronics training in the service. So I decided I wanted to be an electrical engineer, and that was in 1958. And I attended the University of Pittsburgh. And to tell you something about the kind of guy I am, as a freshman, I got all A's, but that's not the story. The story is that I said I liked the academic life so much that I was going to get a PhD. And so I stayed at Pitt, and in 1958, I got my bachelor's degree, 62 a master's degree, and in 64 a PhD. When I was in the service, my first leave home, I married Marilyn Sharp Weber. She was 20, or I was 20, and she was 18. Naturally, they said it would never last, and we've been married 55 years, going on 56 now. But she's been my friend, and we had 3 children. David's the oldest, Lisa's the next, and William's the last. And let's see. Now, then I started in at Pitt and got my bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD. As a little side note, that's where I met Dr. Andy Rive, who did so much for FIT, and I'll have some things to say about him later. And Andy and I were office partners. In fact, we were sitting side by side, the only 2 Democrats in the whole institution, and when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And that was a heartbreaker to us. Interestingly enough, John Miller, Andy Rive, and I all came from similar backgrounds. We all had Slavic ancestry. John's father was a Yugoslav. My mother was a Bohemian, and Andy's grandparents, I think, came somewhere from the Balkan states. We all served in the military, and we all came from Pittsburgh, as did Jerry Lauterbach. So when I got my doctorate degree, I came down to work for RCA, Missile Test Project. And there's where I met Jerry Cooper and Denton Clark, who was my boss, and a man who did a great deal for FIT, a man named Larry Mertens, who was a diver. He was an electrical engineer, but he had great interest in marine life and things like that. I was at the Eastern Test Range for about 18 months, and in fact, I worked in the same group that Jerry was the manager of. Jerry Cooper was the manager of. And then I was promoted to the staff engineering position at RCA MTP. And I wrote the first tracking plan for the calibration satellite, which was used to calibrate the instrumentation around the world. I was the staff engineer, and Jerry Cooper approached me in, I think it was early 1966, about coming to FIT. And I had always wanted to be, my ambition was to be at a university. And I saw a great opportunity here. And I accepted his offer. Now that's the closest that Marilyn and I have ever come to divorce, because I was making $22,000 a year there as the staff engineer, which was a very, very good salary. and I agreed to come to FIT for $16,000 a year to head up the electrical engineering department. Mostly I came here because I felt that there was a great opportunity to build something that was unique, and I think we have done that.
What was the campus like when you first visited?
Well, there was the library, Brownlee Hall, the registrar's office, I don't know what they call it now, but it's the building next to the president's office, and there was a president, and they had just added 4 buildings in the quad. Originally there were 2 buildings on the end of the president's office there, and then they added 2 more. Now, one of those buildings was the last on the right was dedicated to the electrical engineering department. So when I came on campus, it was a completely empty building and was not finished yet. In fact, I had to go out and in the military, I learned how to midnight requisition things. So I went out and did a midnight requisition on an air conditioner, and I boarded up a door and put it in a door so that we could air condition the labs. And that was when my wife first saw FIT. I know that her shoes, her heart fell down in her shoes because we had come from the University of Pittsburgh. Right in the middle of Oakland is this 46-story Cathedral of Learning, which is very impressive, and then you walk here and
it's a little bit different.
Yes, right.
Sure. Well, you came in and dug in with the electrical engineering department. What was it like when you first came on board?
Well, we had a multitude of students. We had that was 1964, September of 66. Let me tell you the sequence here. John Miller and I have always had a running battle about who was hired first. He claims he was hired first, and I claim that I was hired first. But at any rate, we both came on in September of 1966. The original plan was to make Ray Work the Dean of Engineering, and he would have been my boss as head of the electrical engineering department. When John Miller came on, they made him Dean of Academics. I'm not sure of the exact title. And then I reported as the department head directly to John Miller. That was a unique situation because that's when the team of Miller, Weber, Rive, and Enstis was formed. All of these people, excluding me, were instrumental in making this what it is today. And we were a team that we were complementary to each other in that we worked well together, and we had different talents. John was a superb academician. He had never served in any administrative positions. Andy and I Andy came a year later, but Andy and I had come from a very academic environment, and in fact we had participated in accreditation of programs and things like that. We had a strong academic environment. Even as a graduate student, you learned a lot about the ethics and the way a good department should be run. We were fortunate enough to work under a very distinguished educator. His name was Dr. John Calvert, and during World War II, interestingly enough, he built some of these huge defluxing things where you would drive demagnetizing things, where you would drive a whole battleship or a whole cruiser into it, and they would demagnetize the iron in the ship so that the ships would not get destroyed by mines. And so that was when, and what we found basically when we came here was a graduate school that had a lot of students, but the organization and paperwork was kind of in disarray. We also found that we had a junior class, which included Dick Ensis as one of the students, and no senior laboratories for electrical engineering. No junior and senior laboratories for electrical engineering. The way it worked, they had physics laboratories in that, but no electrical engineering laboratories, because this was the first full-time electrical engineering group that came along. The curriculum, other than in the space-related things, was a little outdated. Many of the people who had set it up had been in World War II. We had been in the Korean War, so we got a much more modern curriculum. So that was one of the big challenges here when we first came, is to update the curriculum. When I came, they had hired one young man. We had 200 part-time graduate students in electrical engineering working on a master's degree. There was Harry Weber and a young new PhD named Dr. Jim Bigelow from the University of Virginia. And together, that was our complement. We had a very, very, very strong faculty, adjunct faculty from Harris. Harris, if it weren't for Harris, there would be no FIT today. That is clear to me. These people were at the forefront of technology. They were designing new and innovative communication systems, and we had one of the best communication systems curriculum in the country. And so we had a challenge. The challenge that was presented to me by Jerry Cooper when he hired me was, all right, Harry, you're going to come down here and you're going to get us engineering accreditation. And I said, well, I think I've had experience with that, not as a leader, but as a follower, and I think I knew what to do. And he said, okay. Now, they had, I came in '66, and they had gotten Southern Association of Colleges and Schools the previous year in '65. So I had nothing to do with the first accreditation of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. I was brought here to get engineering education accreditation. Now, engineering accreditation is different than the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools because the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools accredits the institution. Engineering accredits the program. So you could have a mechanical engineering program that isn't accredited and have an electrical engineering that is accredited. The question that I asked Jerry Cooper was, now, this is a tough accreditation to get. Are you going to support me? And he said, yes, that's going to be our primary thrust. We're going to get the first olive out of the jar with everything from electrical engineering. And I thought that was a good strategy. It makes it easier to get other programs accredited when you already have it.
Tough one, sure.
The next year, I hired Andy Rive. That's an interesting story in itself, but I'll wring the water out of it. Andy came down here. He saw FIT. He saw what I had seen the previous year. We didn't have the science building or any facilities. He was an associate professor working on tenure at the University of Pittsburgh. And I thought, well, I'll get him down here in May or so when it's nice weather and, you know, we can, and he came down and I showed him around, and then I took him here to the Melbourne airport and I put him on the airplane. And I said to myself, that's the last I'll see of Andy Rive. So, but I said to him anyways, I said, Andy, I said, do you want us to make you an offer? And he said, yes, yeah, I'll consider an offer. So we made him an offer, and I think it was like $16,000 a year. And I got a letter from him, and it said, in the interest of good negotiations, I'll come if you give me $500 more. Well, I was running around a quad with this letter saying, wow, we got him, we got him, because he was really instrumental in bringing accreditation to FIT, as was I. So Andy joined us the next year, and then we set out to get accreditation. So that was the early days, and then we can go on from there with the accreditation or whatever you'd like.
Sure. Well, one of the big challenges, of course, in accreditation and everything else in those days were finances and the securing of grants.
Yeah.
You had a lot to do with Florida Tech's first success
Yeah, if
in the
you
grant area.
if it's all right with you, here's what I'll do. I think I can lead into that.
Sure.
But
Go right ahead.
I want to go into why I was involved in a lot of things, and I will do it this way. In September 1966, I came here as head of the electrical engineering department. In September 1968, I was appointed Dean of Graduate Studies and Research. However, all of the time I was at FIT, I carried two hats, except for the first 2 years. I also stayed on as head of the electrical engineering department, so I was a dean and a head. In June 1971, I was appointed the Dean of Science and Engineering. And I'd like to say something about that, the science and engineering aspect. And I stayed on as Dean of Graduate Studies and Research. In January 1980, I was appointed Associate Vice President for academic affairs, and I stayed on as the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research. So when I left FIT, but I didn't really leave FIT, in June 1982, FIT became affiliated with a college called Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne College. Now, it hung its hat primarily on aviation. They appointed a acquaintance of Jerry Cooper, a man named Gene Hipschman, who was a professor of physics at Huntsville, Alabama, as head of as president of Nathaniel Hawthorne College. Now, Nathaniel Hawthorne College was an aviation school primarily. The first year that Hipschman was there was not a very successful year, and the college seemed to be going downhill instead of progressing, and FIT was putting money into the college. So they asked me to go up there on a fact-finding mission in the winter of 1982. No. January of 1982. Let me put it that way.
Sure.
And to come back and give them I was kind of the troubleshooter. If things went wrong on this campus, they would ask me, for example, the computing center, the computing center on campus, both the business and academic center, was having problems. When things like that would happen, they would ask me if I would take it over. My skill is really in organizing things. I get things organized, and I get policies in place, and I give people assignments, and they pretty much, I let them alone, and they do it, and if they don't do it, then we try some other plan. And so I wrote a report saying that Hawthorne was in trouble, and that primarily the man was not putting the time in necessary to do the job. So then I came back, and I should never have done that because they asked me if I would go up there and take a leave of absence from FIT, but still be on the FIT payroll, and be the president of Hawthorne College for 2 years. I said, yes, I would do that. My children were in their 20s now, and I felt that I could leave them okay. And I took Marilyn up there, and we moved into the president's house. And 2 years turned into 3 years, and 3 years turned into 4 years, and 4 years turned into 4.5 years. And then there was some turmoil here at FIT. Jerry was retiring, and the fervor for Hawthorne College ran out, so I said that I was coming back to Florida. And then I joined RCA again, MTP. I had basically Jerry Cooper's old job as, but now as a directorship. I was director of systems analysis there, and we did all the analysis. I had 70 scientists that worked for me, and that's where I finished out my career. So that's that. Now, I just wanted you to see how it stacked up and how I progressed through the organization and why I got into so many different things. Now the grants and contracts. That first research grant that FIT got was in 1967. It was a grant that I got, and Andy Rive was on it. I was the principal investigator, and Andy was the co-investigator, and it was for something that I had been doing at the Eastern Test Range with the calibration satellite and that. It was engineering analysis of a special radar. And that was the first grant was that FIT ever got was $18,000 from the U.S. Air Force. The first federal grant that FIT ever had was from the National Science Foundation. The first national grant they ever had was a proposal that I wrote, and I'll give you a little story about that. And I don't mean I wrote it, but I was the editor of it, and quite a bit of it I wrote, but I got inputs from all the departments, obviously, and I had a good team. It was called the College Science Improvement Program. But I had a concept all my life where I wanted to put together a school of science and engineering. That has since gone by the way. But for a long time, we did have a school of science and engineering here at FIT. And the idea behind this was to put together scientists and engineers in an applied environment, put out products, sell their ideas. For example, the theory of optics has been known for a long time, but now they're doing wonderful things with optics and tracking stars and things like that. Radio telescopes, those people that were applied. I didn't want to get theoretical physicists or theoretical mathematicians. I wanted the people, if they were going to be mathematicians, they better be working on algorithms or numerical analysis things that could be applied now. And so that was one of the questions that I asked every faculty member I ever hired. Are you a theoretician or are you applied? Did you put out products? And I didn't hire people who were theoretical. Not that I had anything against them, but the problem is that you've got to have a think tank when you have these theoretical people like Princeton or something like that.
Sure.
And so we were in an applied environment, a very applied environment, and I just felt that we should have the science and engineers working side by side. So the reason I tell that story is because if you look at the title of this program, the College Science Improvement Program, it really wasn't for engineers. But since I was the Dean of Science and Engineering, I pulled all the engineering departments in. Electrical engineering was in it, well, whatever we had at that time, whatever was on that list. Now that was in 1971. Now, I had been here 5 years and we had been building these programs for 5 years. And basically, it was to take programs that were just on the verge of emerging and get them over the hump. And that was an award of $250,000. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of money in this day and age.
Was then.
It was then. And it involved laboratories and hiring professors and equipment for almost every laboratory, every undergraduate laboratory. Now, we weren't going out buying spectroscopes and things like that. We were buying electronic equipment for the laboratories and things like that. Now, the interesting thing about that is why that was such a boon to FIT. It gave us credibility. If the National Science Foundation is going to back you and give you that kind of money, it gives the school some credibility. Let me see. Now, the other thing that did for us was that we got on surplus property lists. Now, the federal government at that time was taking a lot of equipment, computers, electronic equipment, a multitude of things, trucks, and once you got a grant, you moved up in the pecking order. In other words, once the military was through screening it, we got to screen it next because we had a federal grant. Otherwise, everybody else who had a grant would get to screen it, and then the universities got to screen it.
Sure.
So we got, at face value, over 14 million, now, there are federal dollars and then there are dollars, but we got over $14 million worth of laboratory equipment, antennas, telescopes. There was big telescopes that we got. That dome that we had for so many years we got. And we said that we were going to use this for undergraduate education, and we did do that. We even got classrooms because we had that grant. These classrooms that sat over here that looked like army barracks, I had hauled down from the Cape and refurnished. They called them Splinter Village at the Cape. And we hauled them down here. There was good lumber in them, and it was just a wonderful thing that we could do that. We put new roofs on them, and we had classrooms for 25 years using those. So that really put us in a category where we were no longer struggling. And then the final, let me see, that was in COSIP. And then we had, I got a 1973 at Title IV. I got instructional equipment. That was computers, $23,000. And that was the impetus for our computing center when we moved it over into the quad. And I guess that pretty much wraps that up in my career there.
Well, very busy career. Now, of course, one of the driving forces on campus was Dr. Jerry Cooper.
Correct. Yes.
Everyone who comes here has things they remember about Dr. Cooper. What always struck you about him?
Well, the one thing that was always struck me about Jerry is FIT came first. FIT and Jerry Cooper were inseparable. They were, it was like a mother carrying a baby with Jerry. It was part of him. And as all college presidents do, and I was a college president, at times you have a little paranoia about things. And, there's always times that people want to get to the top and things like that. So one of the things, I can say truthfully that I never had a harsh word with Jerry. Never, all the time I was here. One incident was Jerry, the Science Tower. We call it the Science Tower. I guess they call it the Science Building, but the Science Tower. John Miller and I got together one day and we said, he's got that building, it should be turned around. He's got the windows on the west side and the blank stairwell there on the east side. And you want the windows on the east side where the sun comes up and doesn't get that hot sun in the afternoon for your air conditioning. So we rode Jerry about that. And he finally came up and he said one day, he said, Harry, I'm going to turn that engineering build around. But he said, this is the last damn thing I want to hear about that engineering building, about the science building. So he turned the Crawford Science Building around for us. But those were the kind of exchanges I had with Jerry. Natalie, his wife, was a very gracious person. His daughter, Melanie, was kind of shy. And Philip was a typical surfer. He surfed from sunup to sundown, as did my son. But Jerry was just a tough guy. He was FIT came first, and that was it, and he didn't care who knew it. There's a lot of anecdotes you could tell about Jerry. One was Jerry was just kind of a scholar in his own way, but he wasn't an academic scholar. He did not have much academic experience, where John Miller had a tremendous academic background, I mean, at institutions. And, but Jerry, he was an OSS officer, and he learned to speak Chinese. And so he wanted to learn, we had a Florida-Columbia alliance, and Jerry wanted to learn Spanish, because we would go to Columbia and they would come up here, and we would travel all over Columbia. We'd go to Barranquilla and Ibagué and those places. They even named a public school after Jerry down there. Well, at the dedication of the public school, it was called the Jerome P. Cooper Public School, and I think it was in the main city, the one that's 6,000 miles up Bogota, Bogota, Colombia. And so Jerry gets down there, and we were late, and he rushes up to the platform, and he wanted to say, I'm very embarrassed that I'm late. You know, we were late. Well, you never got anywhere on time in Colombia. That was just one of those things. So Jerry ran up, and he said, he wanted to speak Spanish, and he said, muy embarazado. And the crowd started laughing, and they were having the greatest time. And the Spanish-speaking host came over and whispered in Jerry's ear. He said, in Spanish, Jerry, muy embarazada means I am very pregnant. So that was one of the stories about Jerry. He'll deny that, but I was there. I was there. But Jerry and I got along very well. I don't think we ever had a harsh word. But he did have harsh words with some people he didn't trust. He was that kind of guy.
Tough customer.
Yeah. Yes, he was. Yeah, he was.
Now, Florida Tech has always been known as a place with interesting personalities.
Yes.
Who are the folks that you remember over the years that really made an impression?
Well, obviously, Jerry, John Miller was John and Andy Rive were people of the highest ethical values. They just were ethical people. And if John or Andy told me something wasn't right, I listened to them. There were people down in the trenches, like a guy like Dale Simcox. Dale Simcox was the superintendent of buildings and grounds here. That man, and we didn't have very good equipment, and Jerry was a really a character about his palm trees. In fact, to tell you a story about that, and a story about Dale, is that my first assignment when I came on campus was to go to Stark, Florida, to the surplus property warehouse there, and get silk parachutes. And why would FIT want silk parachutes? Well, they wanted them because we were going to have a freeze, and Jerry wanted to cover up his palm trees. So that was one of my, here's a PhD, you know. And he gave me an old station wagon that didn't have any floorboards, and not a heater, and we were in a cold spell, and sent me up to Stark, Florida, which is near Gainesville.
Sure.
And told me to load up the thing with as many parachutes as he could get. But then what would happen is we'd get back, and Dale would he could get out there, and they'd be putting these parachutes all over these palm trees and smudge pots, and they just worked like dogs most of the time. And Dale was the most cooperative guy. He was always there to help you. What can I do to help you? And he was already up to his ears in work, and he didn't mind as long as he could breathe a little bit. People like that. Hank Hughes, I think, is still here, 38 years working in the buildings and grounds. I always made it a policy to talk to these guys. I learned a lot more from these guys than I did from some of the guys that had PhDs, because they just were, just real people. Tom Rutherford, who was an old friend of Jerry's, he was head of personnel, and he was a registrar. He was here in the early days. Joe Weil he had been the dean of engineering at the University of Florida. He was a physicist, not an engineer, but he retired, and he came down here, and he worked with Jerry in the as Jerry's assistant, as his troubleshooter. Tom Adams Tom had run for lieutenant governor and was Secretary of State of Florida, and he joined FIT and worked with Jerry. We had physics professors that came from very distinguished backgrounds. Jim Potter had been the head of the physics department at Texas A&M, and he when he retired, he came here and joined us. Joel Blatt's father, I can't remember his name now. He was a distinguished chemist with Dow Chemical. He came in and worked with our chemistry department. He had been Joel's dad had been an academician too, but I think he had some connection with Dow Chemical. Joel was a professor in the physics department, and so we had people that just came, and they didn't mind being paid poorly. John Miller once told a story, it's Andy Reary that told a story about me. A faculty member came in and was complaining to Andy. I was the dean, and Andy was the head of the electrical engineering department, and was complaining to Andy about his low pay. And Andy said, I don't know what you're complaining about. He said, Harry Weber treats everyone the same when it comes to salary. And the faculty member said, well, how's that? And Andy said, badly. And so but we had to. There was no choice. We did not have the money. So I think what people fail to realize is when I say that I came over here, I was making $22,000 a year. I came over here for $16,000 a year. Now, in 1964, I had 3 children.
Sure. My
wife, I insisted when we got children, she was going to stay home and raise the kids. I made $4,500. I was 34 years old when I got my PhD, and I didn't have any money in the bank. And so, and I'm saying that because this is the story of a lot of people who came to FIT. They were so dedicated, they were so interested in building something, they were willing to do it for less, and they did it for less. And they didn't complain about it. I mean, they'd all say, Harry, I need more money. And I said, well, if we get it, you'll get it. And that was, that was pretty much the story.
Finances would always be a challenge, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, every summer, at least for the first 4 or 5 years I was here, and I don't know how we ever managed it, we borrowed $500,000 a year. Now, $500,000 to get us through the summer. Once again, in today's money, that doesn't sound a lot. But you go back to 1971 or so, that's a lot of money. And we convinced I didn't, but the FIT, I didn't have anything to do with those finances because that was old John Simmons. And he convinced them to loan us $500,000. So those are the kind of, and we all knew it. I mean, it was no secret. We didn't keep any secret from anybody. That if the money was there, we would, and the budget was open. We had open meetings on the budget. Everybody got all the department heads got to see the other department heads' budget. There was no secrets.
Now, during your career here at Florida Tech, a lot of famous people passed through campus, and I know you got to meet quite a few of them.
Yes.
And talk about some of those folks.
Yeah. Well, being a part physicist myself, that's one of the reasons I had this concept about applied, because I have credentials in physics as well as I have master's degree courses in physics as well as a PhD in engineering. And the students won't recognize this name, but there was a very famous physicist named P.A.M. Dirac. Dirac was the father of quantum mechanics. I had a book written by P.A.M. Dirac in 1936 on quantum mechanics. And I had it on my desk, and P.A.M. Dirac decided to join FSU in their theoretical physics area. So we brought him to campus, and I met him, and I asked him to sign his book for me. And he signed the book from one engineer to another. He was an engineer, and I always thought he was a pure mathematician physicist. Now, he was a very, very famous man, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. Another interesting person we had come to campus was Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was a very, very good friend of FIT's, the Tokyo Raiders. And he came to FIT, and we called it Doolittle Day. And since I was an engineer and Jimmy Doolittle was an aerospace engineer, they asked me to be his escort. Naturally, I was very, very flattered to be an escort for Jimmy Doolittle. So I escorted him around most of the day. I got to talk with him. You know how it is when you're a young professor. I was like 35 or 36, and here's this very distinguished man. And what people don't understand is that Doolittle's feat of being able to take off from an aircraft carrier was much a science and engineering accomplishment as it was a military accomplishment. Because without the right calculations and things like that, they'd have never been able to do it. But the funny part of this story is that I was in the men's room with Jimmy. I went everywhere he went, and so I had a minute to get him alone, and I said to him, would you please sign a poster? I have your poster here. And he said, well, if you'll let me finish what I'm doing here, I'll be glad to sign your poster. So he had a tremendous sense of humor. What a great guy. All of these people had a wonderful sense of humor. Harold Edgerton conducted the Bikini Atoll tests where they exploded atomic bombs, and then they photographed the explosion. And he put, it was called, photography, where you stop photography.
Time lapse?
Time lapse.
No,
it was where you shine a light on it and then take a picture of it. You took a picture of bullets and things like that. I've got a picture of a bullet. Strobe, the strobe.
Okay.
The strobe. Okay. And he was the father of the strobe. And I've got a picture signed by him that shows a bullet going through an apple, and you can see the bullet coming out the other side, and the apple bursting, but it didn't. The speed of the bullet was so fast and so quick that it didn't knock the apple off the stand, like William Tell. Harold Edgerton, I spent time with him, and in fact, they founded a company that was big. One thing I wanted to mention is Jim Storms, who was was an engineer as well as a management. He had a PhD in management, but he had a master's degree in engineering. Jim worked with Harold Edgerton on the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb test. Jim Storms was 10 years older than I, so he was in World War II and I was in the Korean War. But I wanted to mention that Jim, it's too bad we couldn't get to interview Jim, because Jim was a wonderful person, and he, more than anything, did a lot to generate income with these off-campus programs. There's some interesting stories about that. But I went out to dinner one night with Harold Edgerton, and my mother always called me Sonny. She would call in. I'm a 40-year-old man. I'm a dean or vice president, and she would say to my secretary, Phyllis Jablonski, who was a wonderful person, she would say, "Phyllis, I'd like to speak to Sonny." Now, here's me. I'm about 40, I guess, with Harold. He's 65 or so. His mother's 85. We're out at this exclusive restaurant having dinner, and Harold's mother is calling this distinguished man Sonny. Now, if that wasn't an evening, we had a ball. One other story I'll tell is it has to do with commencement. There's a couple stories I'll tell about commencement. We had Claude Kirk here. Now, Claude Kirk was the governor of Florida, and he was a big man. And I was his escort. Now, being an escort on commencement day, as dean of the graduate school, I would have to make sure he got his cap and gown, got his hat on right, and so on and so forth. Well, when we got him there, we knew he was a big man, so we told him, send us the biggest mortar board you can find. Well, the biggest mortar board wasn't big enough for him. He had a huge head. I mean, just a huge head, Claude Kirk. So we finally put it on with bobby pins. And he agreed to that. But at that commencement, we have chimes over here in the Gleason Auditorium. There's a chime. Now, what they're supposed to do is, when a procession was walking across the street to the old auditorium, they were supposed to play Pomp and Circumstances. Well, somebody got it plugged in wrong, and what they started to play was, I Found $1 Million Baby at the 5 and 10 cent store. Now, we laughed about that for years, and everyone insists it was Perry Clendenin, who was one of the pioneers here, that programmed that thing wrong. The other thing I'd like to tell is about John Miller. John was the typical absent-minded professor. And at commencement, I would always sit next to him. I was his guardian. And it would go like this. Harry, where's my glasses? What happened to my glasses? And his hood would be down over this arm like this, cocked like this, and he'd be all askew. And I'd say, they're on your head, John. Then he'd say, what'd I do with the program, Harry? What'd I do with the program? Well, he just was a typical absent-minded professor, and everybody got the biggest kick out of John at commencement. And he'd be running around like a chicken with his head cut off, you know. But there were good times. They were good times. We all laughed about these things, and these are the things that happen at small institutions where people double in all sorts of things. You know, Perry, who's the treasurer, is over there setting up chimes for the commencement exercise, because you were
multitasking before there was such a thing.
Multitasking, yes. So not only did we had we had a great time. We had a great fellowship here. I told my wife, I've often told the story that I never came to work one day that I felt bad about going to work. I always wanted to come over here. It just, the environment, the people, the can-do attitude was just remarkable. You couldn't fail with people like that, and it was just something that permeated the whole campus. And I'd like to think that we all had something to do with that.
Sure. Now, when we do these interviews, we ask everybody who comes here to imagine 50 years in the future for the Florida Tech Centennial. This is an opportunity for you to send a message to those folks who are going to be watching this interview then about what Florida Tech has meant to you in your life and your career.
Well, I think sprinkled throughout this presentation, I guess for me, it's I love Florida Tech, but Florida Tech has given me back more than I've ever given it. In the satisfaction, I don't know whether. Well, I'm going to say this. My ambition was to be a college president before I was 55 years old. Now, I had hoped that would be president of FIT. Instead, it was the presidency of Hawthorne College. So I was 55 in June 20th, and June the 2nd, I became president of Hawthorne College. So I realized my ambition. Now, I would hasten to say that I wanted to be a candidate for the presidency of FIT when Jerry retired. I was not a candidate. I think they picked the right guy. I think you can look around here, and Weaver did a remarkable job. I mean, you can see this campus, amazing. And if you had asked me in 1964 that you would have here, this is beyond my wildest dreams, what they have here now.
It amazes you when you come on campus,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's absolutely amazing the way this place has grown. I had trouble finding this laboratory today because there's so much here. And in 50 years, let me say this. I have a little different concept of universities. My concept is that when, and this was what I had hoped for FIT, is a university maybe of 5,000 to 7,000 students. Now, why do I say that? I think that it's my philosophy that when a university gets so big, it's unmanageable. You get enclaves and you don't have that spirit anymore. Now, if I had my druthers, I would like to see FIT in 100 years as a university that's the greatest university in the world with 5,000 to 7,000 students. But I know that isn't going to happen. So I'll say in 50 years, I'd like to see it be the greatest technical institution in the world.
All right. Well, anything else you'd like to add? Any comments or thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I did an awful lot of talking, didn't I? Huh?
No.
There was one of the things that I did want to mention is that when you have double duties, there's a lot you have to give up in life for that. For example, I used to, as dean of the graduate school and head of the electrical engineering department, I obviously had to be here every day between 9 and 5. But the graduate school here at FIT was conducted mostly in the evening. And I felt that a good dean should be here when the graduate program, and I would just go around sometimes and make sure that the classes were meeting. I never went into anybody's classroom. I didn't believe in people in authority going in a classroom. I felt that what went on in the classroom was the privacy, and they teach the way, and if I didn't have confidence in people. But every Tuesday and Thursday, I'd be here till 10 o'clock at night. I'd leave home at 9, and many of the Saturdays I worked. Now, I'm saying that a lot of people did this. This is what made FIT go. You just had to do more. You had to do double duties, or it would not have gone. And I just wanted to make sure that people understand not my sacrifice, but the sacrifice that a lot of people made for FIT and for their professional development as well, because a lot of people developed. My philosophy has always been that a university only needs two things: students and faculty. And administrators are facilitators. They make it possible for the students and the faculty to do their thing. And I sincerely believe that. And I think that if universities get too big, the administrators become more important than the students and faculty. Sometimes that role gets reversed. Not always. Not always. So Jerry Cooper always wanted FIT to be like MIT. I wanted them to be MIT in a certain way without the amenities that they have. And I guess that's what I wanted. Let me see, is there anybody else? Oh, another person I want to mention, because I don't think he's going to get mentioned, was a person called David Jones.
Okay.
Davy Jones was he was a general. He was here at Patrick Air Force Base. He was a commander, but he was one of the original Doolittle Raiders. I had a book written by a man named Glines called The Doolittle Raiders, and they held a reunion every year, and at their 25th reunion, I think it was, something like that, I asked him if he would take this book and have it signed by the remaining Doolittle Raiders. And he said yes, he would do that. And I have a book at home that's signed, I'm not sure what the date was, but I think it was somewhere in the 70s, by I think 25 or 28 of the Doolittle Raiders that were still alive at that time. Davy was on the Board of Trustees of FIT and was a good friend. He was also, I think, the president of Satellite Beach Bank when he retired from the military. A story about Davy is, I asked him one time, what was it that worried him so most about the Doolittle raid? And he said it worried him that they were going to run out of gas before they got back. And he said, that's an experience. He never talked about it, but he said that they were flying and they didn't know exactly where they were because all of that part of the world was blacked out. He said he wasn't sure whether he was over the ocean or over land, but he knew he was near China, in China somewhere, or near China. And he said since he was the pilot, he had the crew bail out. And then he said he got up and walked to the door, and he said, you know, Harry, he said, that was the biggest, blackest hole I think I've ever seen. Now you can imagine bailing out of an airplane and not knowing where you are, whether you're going to land in the ocean or land in communist territory or what. And this was a kind of, Davy was one, like, these were the kind of people that were associated. Von Braun was here at FIT. Edward Teller, one of the great physicists of all times, the father of the hydrogen bomb, was here at FIT. We had a scientific advisory board that consisted of Harold Edgerton, Stark Draper, who was head of the lab at MIT, the Draper Lab at MIT. They designed all of the inertial guidance systems that are on our missiles. The most accurate inertial guidance systems in the world. Jacques Cousteau. Was it Jacques Cousteau? No, the other one. The guy who had the underwater, the submarine that his dad was a balloonist and he was a submariner. He went to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, the deepest dive that's possible, 35,000 feet. Not Cousteau. Well,
Possibly Picard?
Huh?
Picard?
Picard, Jacques Picard. He was there, and then there was one other man. Bill Pickering. Bill Pickering was the head of the Space Technology Lab at California Institute of Technology. They would come every year. We would all meet with them. We would all make presentations, and then they would give us advice on where we ought to go from there. And they were the scientific board, and they met for 5 or 6 years. Now they all aged. They were all kind of World War II guys. But we had somehow or other, Jerry could convince some of the. Well, he was an MIT graduate, and he had some contacts at MIT. But these people were very, very helpful.
Sure.
I guess that's about it.
Well, on behalf of everyone at Florida Tech, thank you for your many years of service and making our university what it is.
I hope
thank
it wasn't
you, sir.
too much Harry Weber, but I can't. I didn't say me or I or too many times, but it's.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.